Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, stories around photographs can be unpredictable. You never know how you're going to find them and where you're going to find them. This is a case in point. I picked up this image recently and I purchased it and added it to my collection because it's just a great occupational image of a farrier posed with a uh, horse, sort of a horseshoe shaped shovel slash pick. He has a small hammer. A wood device for usage in his work, and then hanging behind him is a bridle. Just a great occupational image from the 1860s. Unidentified, have no idea who he is. However, there's a bit of a clue to his location on the back of the photograph. You'll notice right away the stamp with the crosses through it. Well, that's a revenue tax stamp that was levied by the United States government between 1864 and 1866 to pay for the Civil War, which had become crazy expensive. 4 years of war. So the tax helped pay for that. Below that tax stamp, you'll see an imprint of the photographer's name, and it says by Dali or Dali, Dalee, and then beneath that, Lawrence, Kansas. So we have a location, Lawrence, Kansas, and we have a name. We can assume this is the surname of a photographer, at least an assumption until we find more information. And this is where our story is. I began to research photographers in Lawrence, Kansas from the 1864 to 1866 period. And guess who I find? The man pictured here. His name is Ammon Gilbert Daly. He was born in 1820. And wow, is his story interesting. It is in some ways a classic story of 19th century westward expansion in America. It's also a Civil War story in one of the great Confederate guerrilla raids, the Lawrence Massacre. He was in it, he was part of it. So let me tell you a little bit about him because he doesn't start out in Kansas. His life begins in New York, where he's born and raised. His father was a painter of miniatures. And so young Ammon starts in his father's footsteps and becomes a portrait painter. This is in New York. In 1845, he gets married. They have a son together. And then they have that scratched itch, that urge to wander and to find some adventures in life. They head out to Michigan and stay there for a little while. And then in 49, you've got the gold rush going on. And well, Ammon and his wife, her name is Clorinda, by the way, and their baby son, Justice, named for Ammon's father, they move out to California. And by all accounts, he does pretty well as a miner. In 1852, you can trace them to El Dorado County, where he's listed as a miner. So whatever he was chasing, and we can assume that it was gold, or who knows what other minerals he was after, but gold is a good guess. He's doing that in the mid 50s, the early to mid 50s. But at some point, he starts getting another scratch, that the urge to scratch that arts itch, the arts itch that his father had that led him to become a painter of miniatures. That starts to get to him. And it's around this time, about 1855, that he discovers photography. And over the next few years, he learns the trade and begins to hone his skills and his abilities and winds up all up and down the West Coast. By some accounts, he's an itinerant photographer. He has galleries. I find he has galleries in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, and then he turns up in Oregon and later Olympia in Washington Territory. all of this is happening over a relatively short period of time, about 1855 to 1858. Meanwhile, in Kansas, where there's a great battle going on for free staters and slave staters trying to figure out what that territory is going to become. Well, Ammon is doing this thing in California. In 1858, he heads back east for a while. Not sure why, but he heads back east. And then he decides to go out to Lawrence, where all of this fighting is going on for the free versus slave state. So by the end of 1858, he's in Lawrence, sets up shop there, and becomes, by all accounts, a pretty darn good photographer. So that's where he is when the Civil War begins. In 1863, William C. Quantrill, depending upon how you want to classify him, he is a guerrilla, he is a partisan ranger, he's part of an irregular force of hundreds of men who are riding up and down, call them lawless bands, loosely affiliated with the Confederate Army. They wind up involved in a shoot up, burning, looting, pillaging of Lawrence, Kansas in 1863. It's a lot of destruction. By some accounts, as many as 150 to 200 boys and men of military age are gunned down, presumably dead, as part of all this. Among the buildings that are burned is Ammon's studio. Not only that, he is shot in the neck and left for dead. Miraculously, he's not. They find him alive. He's left for dead. They assume he's dead, but they find him alive. The studio is a complete loss, as is a big chunk of Lawrence, but he makes it out of this and he survives. Goes back home for a couple of years, and then he comes back to Lawrence and reestablishes his setup, reestablishes his studio and his shop. It's about this time that he takes the photograph of the farrier, the photograph that I added to my collection recently. So that's how the whole story loops around. Quite interesting, completely a surprise to me. I was not familiar with him as a photographer and did not know of any of his connection to California, to Lawrence, Kansas, to the massacre, to Quantrill's raid in 1863. So he goes on to live life, and I want to read to you an obituary. He dies in 1879. He's about 58 years old. He goes on a trip to Colorado. He's in the mountains. He gets sick, has some sort of a fever and dysentery, and he succumbs to whatever illness he had. He's survived by his second wife, actually his first wife, Clorinda. They divorced before the Civil War. His second wife, Martha, and two children, Justice from his first marriage, and a daughter, Eliza, from his second marriage, survives. I want to read to you his obituary because I think it gives you a pretty good sense of who he is. This obituary comes from a Lawrence newspaper, and so it's more focused on Kansas, but it gives you a sense of how the people of Lawrence felt about him. They considered him a pioneer for sure. And so here's that obituary, and it's simply titled Obituary. Many hearts will be saddened by the news of the death of Mr. A.J. DeLee. He was an old and honored citizen of Lawrence, known and respected by all, beloved by those who knew him best. He was born in Cambridge, Washington County, New York in 1819. By the way, that's wrong. It was 1820. And came to Kansas in 1858. That's correct. He settled in Lawrence and opened a photograph gallery at the north end of Mass Street in a building owned by Governor Robinson. Sometime after this, he moved his business to the round corner in the second story of a building then owned by Honorable James Blood, where he continued till the Quantrill raid in 1863, when the building was burned with all its contents and Mr. DeLee was left on the ground for dead. He then left Lawrence for a year or two, but soon returned and established himself on Tennessee Street, where he secured a plat of several acres of ground and, for several years, devoted himself very industriously and successfully to small fruits and the growth of evergreens. In the cultivations of raspberries, he was especially successful for several years. But he was at heart, and above all, an artist. And about 10 years ago, he opened a picture gallery at his place of residence. And though it was remote from the business center of town, people soon learned to seek him out when they desired to secure a faultless picture. As a photographic artist, he had no superior west of the Mississippi, and but very few, if any, equals. In 1860, he was married to Miss Martha Lehman of this city, who, with an only daughter about 6 or 7 years of age, are left to mourn his sudden departure to the better land. Mr. DeLee was an earnest and exemplary member of the Baptist Church and blameless in all walks and ways. Before coming to Kansas, he spent several years in California, where he was reported to have been very successful in his business, and we are glad to be able to add that family are left in easy circumstances. It goes on to talk a little bit more about the family and talk about the funeral that was largely attended. Word of his death makes it all the way to the leading trade publication for photography. It's called the Philadelphia Photographer, and he has a obituary in that publication that goes right out and says he was the best photographer west of the Mississippi. So there you have it, the story of Ammon Dali or Dali and his adventures, his life adventures, taking him from New York to Michigan to the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington Territory, Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, being a victim of the Lawrence Massacre or Quantrill's raid in 1863, leaving photography, coming back to photography, and gaining a reputation as the best in the West. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode.